Churchill would only offer a general treaty of alliance and no promises about territory. Molotov cabled the British offer to Stalin contemptuously. "We consider this treaty unacceptable, as it is an empty declaration which the Soviet Union does not need." Molotov assumed that Stalin would agree, but back in the Kremlin, the mood was changing as bad news filtered in from the front. Buoyed up by overconfidence, and once again riding roughshod over generals like Zhukov, in May 1942, Stalin had ordered a reckless new assault to recapture Kharkov, second city of the Ukraine. After a week of fighting, Khrushchev phoned to report that the Soviet forces at Kharkov had driven themselves into a trap and were being encircled by the Germans. Stalin refused even to take the call, put down the phone, as if he knows what he's talking about. It was like June 1941 all over again. Only after 250,000 men were captured and 1,200 tanks written off did Stalin face the facts. With his regime on the ropes once more, Stalin called off the offensive and rethought the priorities of his diplomacy. Stalin dropped his demands for territory. What mattered now was getting the Allies to mount a second front, a British and American assault on mainland Europe to divert German forces from Russia. Stalin cabled Molotov in London. He told him to stop protesting, sign the treaty with Britain, and firm up the Allies' commitment to a second front. Molotov was flabbergasted. But the man whom the British regarded as the hardliner grovelled abjectly to his boss. "I shall act in accordance with the directive. I believe the new draft treaty can have positive value. I failed to appreciate it at once."
At the Foreign Office, the Grand Alliance was entered into as signatures were appended to the document by the representatives of the high contracting parties. Full understanding was also reached with regard to the creating this year of a second front in Europe.
In mid-1942, Hitler resumed his offensive. The new campaign was directed southeast to seize Russia's oil in the Caucasus. But Stalin still assumed that Hitler's real goal was Moscow. Thanks to Stalin's misplaced deployments, the German advance was even swifter than in 1941. By the end of the summer, the swastika was flying over the highest point in the Caucasus. The Red Army had lost another 600,000 prisoners and thousands more tanks. The pattern was the same as 1941. Armoured pincers and mass encirclements, rants from Stalin about not one step back, and new orders for blocking units to shoot those trying to flee. In July 1942, with the Red Army collapsing, Stalin was once again desperate for help. Stalin now really needed Churchill to deliver on the promise of a second front in Europe in 1942. But nothing seemed to be happening. Stalin sensed that he was being betrayed by the old enemy. Personal and secret, Premier Stalin to Premier Churchill. In spite of the agreed communique concerning the urgent tasks of creating a second front in 1942, the British government postpones this matter until 1943. Relations between London and Moscow were reaching crisis point. As the German juggernaut rolled east, rumours swirled around about Soviet capitulation and peace talks. A new Nazi-Soviet pact would be a disaster for Britain. For the British, Stalin's military blunders opened up a terrifying scenario. Churchill's chief of staff, Alan Brooke, noted in his diary, "While we are talking, the Germans are walking through the Caucasus. Our defences in Iraq and Persia are lamentably weak." If the Germans smashed through the Caucasus to Iraq and Persia, they would grab most of Britain's oil. Neutral Turkey would probably throw in its lot with Hitler, perhaps even allowing a link-up with Rommel's army in Egypt, now steamrolling towards the Suez Canal. The Germans might even join forces with the Japanese to threaten India from the west as well as the east. Nightmares perhaps, but all too real and vivid at the time. In 1941, Russia's collapse threatened to expose the British Isles to the Nazi war machine. In 1942, the whole British Empire seemed at stake because of Stalin's military bungling. While Stalin felt betrayed by Churchill over the promise of a second front, Churchill doubted Stalin's ability to hold out against Hitler. Without trust, the alliance was doomed. Churchill felt that he and Stalin had to meet face to face. In the middle of August 1942, after a long flight dodging German fighters, Churchill arrived in Moscow. Churchill was excited to meet Stalin for the first time and keen to get the measure of the man. But he was also anxious. He was about to give Stalin an update on the second front that wouldn't be welcome. It was, he said, like carrying a large lump of ice to the North Pole. At 7 that evening, Churchill was ushered into Stalin's office. First impressions were not flattering. At the door was a bald, nervous dwarf, actually Stalin's secretary, Alexander Poskrovyshev. And Stalin himself didn't look particularly impressive. Attired as usual in lilac tunic, baggy trousers and long boots. This was actually standard Communist Party dress, but to the British, he looked a bit of a yokel. For Stalin, a gangster from the Caucasus, used to manipulating cronies and underlings, having to negotiate with a grandee from the West, face to face and on equal terms, was a new experience. A first test, if you like, of his ability to play in the Premier League of international diplomacy. And I think that the records of his meetings with Churchill throw a revealing light on Stalin's effectiveness as a statesman, as he learnt to manage Russia's wartime alliances for his own ends. To start with, the meeting was heavy going. Stalin admitted that the news from the Caucasus was bad. Churchill spoke defensively about all the problems of mounting a second front in France that year. Stalin looked grim. What about a smaller operation, he asked, like recapturing the Channel Islands? Churchill said it would be a waste of seed corn for the real harvest, which would come in 1943. Stalin, who was used to wasting tons of seed corn, replied testily, "A man who isn't prepared to take risks cannot win a war." But then Churchill revealed that he and the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, had a top-secret plan which would be every bit as good as a second front offensive against mainland Europe. He drew a sketch of a crocodile. Northern France, he said, was Hitler's hard snout, but the Mediterranean was his soft belly. Churchill promised that in the autumn, British and American troops would land in Morocco and Algeria. If North Africa was won in 1942, he said, we will launch a deadly attack on Hitler next year. Stalin was now fully engaged. He asked a lot of questions. The meeting broke up after 3.5 hours. The British Prime Minister was driven back to the dacha he had been assigned. Churchill was jubilant. My strategy was sound, he crowed. First, he'd given Stalin the bad news. Then he'd offered glad tidings. Stalin, he said, ended enthusiastic, in a glow. Churchill declared that Stalin was just a peasant whom he knew exactly how to handle.